What was news, and that we didn't believe at first, was that the people who were most likely to stay healthy and happy as they went through life were the people who were most connected to other people.
Welcome to the Coaching Revealed podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Austin Matzel. In this episode of Coaching Revealed, we revisit Robert Waldinger's keynote address at the Institute of Coaching's 2024 Coaching in Leadership and Healthcare Conference. Robert, director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, shares groundbreaking insights from one of the longest-running studies on human life. Following participants for over 80 years, the study assesses misconceptions about sources of happiness, such as fame and personal achievements. And Robert shares the findings from the study that indicate that happiness is heavily correlated with strong relationships. Throughout his talk, Waldinger emphasizes the revolutionary impact of positive relationships on mental and physical health, with social connections helping individuals regulate emotions, reduce stress, enhance resilience, and even improve longevity, whereas chronic isolation leads to health decline, a weakened immune system, and an increased risk of illness. Robert continues his talk by discussing the relationship between age and happiness, noting that individuals tend to make decisions that optimize their contentment as they age. Additionally, he discusses challenges our society faces in developing strong connections within families and the workplace. To close out his talk, Waldinger offers strategies to help individuals build deeper connections with their families and communities. He introduces a framework developed from findings of the Harvard Study of Adult Development that is currently being utilized and encourages coaches and individuals to strengthen their social fitness to enhance overall well-being. Thanks for tuning into Coaching Revealed. Let's get started.
I'm very happy to be here today because you all are working in the area of what I talk about, what I study, human connection. So let me start with something that's gotten a fair amount of publicity in recent weeks, which is the World Happiness Report. That, as you probably know, for many years, we used to believe that if gross domestic product was increasing in our society, that we were getting happier. And we simply equated financial prosperity with well-being. And then somebody about 30, 40 years ago began to look more seriously at this, and they realized that, in fact, in many developed societies, as wealth increased, well-being either flatlined or it went down. And so people began to study well-being in earnest. That's when, among other things, they began to look at happiness around the world. And so in recent years, the World Happiness Report has been issued every year, and it's done by scientists of all sorts of stripes, demographers, sociologists, psychologists, physicians. The question that they ask each year to people all over the world, all age groups, all cultures, is what are the essential things that you need in order to have a good life? And the interesting thing is that the answers are remarkably consistent. That's a surprise, given how wide the sweep of this report is. And they come up with very consistent answers year after year. So yes, it turns out that financial well-being is important. And many of you know this, that actually they've done studies that show that until we have our basic financial needs met, we are much less happy. Until we have food and shelter and the ability to pay for health care and educate our children, all of that matters a great deal. So that the more money you make until you get to a certain threshold matters enormously for your happiness. And so one estimate in this country was $75,000 a year. That's a somewhat arbitrary number, but you get the idea. And then after that, yes, happiness will go up somewhat as we make more money, but it doesn't go up all that much. When we look at people who are unhappy and try to use acquiring wealth as a way toward greater happiness, it doesn't work. So then what do people say? they need in addition to basic financial well-being. There are things that will make total sense to you. Social support, the expectation of a healthy life, and that means access to health care, freedom to make basic life choices. And we know that varies tremendously depending on where we are in the world. One interesting one is generosity. People say that they need opportunities to be generous to other people in order to feel like life is good. And that includes generosity with financial resources, but also with time, with expertise, helping people out. And finally, trust shows up all the time. Trust in governments, the absence of corruption, and trust in our neighbors. All these come up year after year, but when we ask young adults, when we ask people in their 20s, here you are setting out on your life, what are you going to prioritize in order to have a good life? So in 2017, they did a very good survey of this, and over 80% of 20-somethings said that they needed to get rich in order to have a good life. And so it's not just having their basic needs met, it's wealth that they were after. In addition, in that same survey of thousands of 20-somethings, over 50% said that in order to have a good life, they needed to become famous. Which, if you think about it, is a very strange goal. I mean, to have lots of people who don't know you at all know your name and have fantasies about you, that's what you need in order to have a good life, right? And finally, again, over half said they needed to win lots of accolades at work. They needed to push really hard in their work lives. So, what's responsible for this disconnect? Because wealth, fame, high achievement at work aren't the things that show up in the World Happiness Report year after year. Why the disconnect? And we think that now a great deal of the disconnect has to do with the cultural haze that we're all embedded in and don't even notice. All the messages we get all day long, some subliminal, some quite overt, about what the good life consists of. The idea being that the good life gets defined for us instead of by us. Think about the messages you see in advertisements. If you buy this car, you'll be so much more interesting to other people. If you serve this brand of pasta, your family dinners will be blissful. If you use this face, you use this face cream, you'll never look old. You'll never get old, right? And we know, you're all laughing because we know how ridiculous this is, but just watch advertising with that frame of reference, and you'll see how crazy this all is, and that we are steeped in it all day long. Similarly, social media didn't begin any of this, but it has accelerated this kind of messaging. So I took this from Facebook. It's one of those many, many photos that we post for each other when we create curated lives in social media. Where we're having a great time at a party, or we're on a beautiful beach, or we're about to dig into a wonderful plate of food. We don't post the photos when we wake up in the morning depressed or hungover, right? And even though we know that these are partial pictures of lives, on the other hand, it leaves us with the feeling that, oh my gosh, everybody else has this figured out, and I don't. One of my teachers put it this way, and I find this so helpful, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. That we're always comparing the me, who's, sometimes quite happy and sometimes kind of miserable and feeling lost, with those visions of life that are presented to us. So I'm making the case for why you would spend so much of your career doing what I've been doing. Now, the other thing is that we're told what our bodies are supposed to look like. We laugh at this, but think about the norm on the left-hand side of the screen. We just take it for granted that this is what we're going to be shown about what human beings are supposed to look like. And what a distortion of who we are. What I do instead is I study what happens to real people over their whole adult lives. And most of what we know about adult life, we know either from the cultural haze we're in, or in research, we know it by asking people to remember the past. And asking people to remember the past is a perfectly reasonable way to collect information about life. But we also know that our memories are full of holes. I mean, think about what you had for dinner a year ago today. I mean, you have no idea unless it was a very special occasion, right? Most of what comes into our minds is not recalled. We wouldn't be able to. Our memories are also creative. We know from good cognitive science experiments that the very act of recalling a memory changes it. And this, of course, is a great source of distress for people in our justice system because eyewitness testimony has great flaws. Simply asking people to remember the past is one way, but following people forward, I'm making a case for what I do, is another way to understand life in a very powerful way. Now, the other thing that is typically done when we want to study how life proceeds over decades is to simply take snapshots right now. So what if we want to take a snapshot of depression or diabetes? So I could look at a group of 20-year-olds, a group of 40-year-olds, a group of 60-year-olds, right now, and I could assume that I know what the course of these illnesses is. But in fact, it can lead us to make all kinds of false assumptions. Again, here I am making the case for why you would spend, 4 generations of researchers and 85 years following the same lives, from their teenage years until almost all of them have died. Okay, so the Harvard study of adult development, as far as we know, is the longest in-depth study of the same people that's ever been done. It was actually begun as 2 studies that didn't know about each other in 1938. The first study was from Harvard University Student Health Service. They chose sophomores, 19-year-olds from the classes of 39 to 42, who were thought by their deans to be fine, upstanding specimens. And it was meant to be a study of normal development from adolescence into young adulthood. So if you want to study normal development, you study all white guys from Harvard, right? I mean, so it is the most politically incorrect scientific sample you could imagine right now. And so we're constantly having to explain to NIH why they should still fund us to continue this study. But the other part of our study, 2/3 of our participants, began as boys, as 10, 11, 12-year-old boys in Boston's inner city, in the poorest neighborhoods, but not just the poorest neighborhoods, among the most troubled families. So these were children who were chosen from families that were known on average to 5 social service agencies in the city of Boston in 1938 for problems like domestic violence, severe parental mental illness, physical illness, extreme poverty. The reason why they were chosen was that it was a study at Harvard Law School of juvenile delinquency, and specifically why some children from really difficult backgrounds managed to stay on good developmental paths, despite all the predictions that they should not succeed in life. In addition, eventually we brought in spouses of this World War II generation, and then we brought in the second generation, the children, most of whom are baby boomers now, and we are still studying them to this day. When we began the study in 1938, we brought people into our laboratory. We did long interviews, psychological interviews, physical exams. We went to their homes. And researchers actually sat down, talked to the parents and sometimes the grandparents, and made detailed observations about disciplinary style in the home and what the curtains looked like on the windows. It's a wonderful exercise in sociology. And then eventually, the Harvard undergraduates were of an age to go to the Second World War. Almost all served in the war. Most came back. The inner city boys were boys, so they were not, on average 9 years younger, so they weren't eligible for the war. But then all of them entered into the usual walks of life, doctors, journalists, factory workers, bricklayers. One president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, The Boston Strangler was part of the inner city sample. But most of these people were not famous. They were not infamous. They were living their lives. And then eventually we followed them out into retirement and well beyond. About 10 are still alive of the original 724 people. And all those 10 are over age 100. But their children are still participating with us, and we're still in touch with these families, which has been a great privilege. The reason why this is so unusual is that most longitudinal studies stop before 5 years are up, or 10 years at the most, because too many people drop out. The problem when too many people drop out is that you don't know what's happened, and you don't know why the people who stayed with you. So it's hard to characterize who those people are. So scientifically, it's not worth continuing. Only 22% of our several thousand people total have dropped out over 85 years. That's almost unheard of. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we sent them thank you notes when they would fill out a form. We sent them birthday cards. We found them doctors when they came to us needing help. Occasionally, we made them loans when they were in trouble. This was not a hands-off study, which has its own limitations, as you can imagine, but it's one way that you keep a community feeling like a community. So what did we study? We studied mental health, physical health, for the Harvard men, World War II experiences, with a lot of emphasis on post-traumatic stress, work life, relationships, and eventually aging and retirement.
Ready to advance your coaching practice? Join the Institute of Coaching and tap into the world's leading resource for coaching science and professional development. With over 4,000 members across 130 countries, the IOC offers invaluable networking opportunities with an elite global coaching community and innovative learning to broaden your knowledge and keep you at the forefront of coaching best practices. Engage in cutting-edge learning events with world-renowned coaching scholars, from webinars and seminars to discussion groups, research projects, and more. Try any membership free for 30 days. Use promo code IOC Podcast and visit instituteofcoaching.org/join to get started.
So we've studied these big domains over and over again, first with medical records, interviews, physical exams, but then eventually, as new methods came online, we put people into the MRI scanner and watched their brains light up as we showed them different kinds of images. We draw blood for DNA now and messenger RNA, things that weren't imagined in 1938. All of this is to give us as broad and as rich a picture as we can get of what thriving looks like as people go through their lives. So, what did we find? Well, hundreds of papers, scores of books, and certainly what we found, which will not surprise you, is that if we take care of our physical health, it matters enormously for how long we live and how long we stay free of disability. So that's not news. What was news, and that we didn't believe at first, was that the people who were most likely to stay healthy and happy as they went through life were the people who were most connected to other people. Literally, the people who saw more people in a given week, who felt warmer about their relationships, were less likely to develop type 2 diabetes, less likely to develop heart disease, the preventable but ubiquitous diseases of aging. We didn't believe this at first, because it makes sense, if you think about it, that we'd be happier if we were more connected to others. I mean, you all are finding this at this conference, right? That's a no-brainer. But how could relationships get into our bodies and literally change our physiology? And then what we began to see was that other research groups were finding the same thing. That's another important point, that no single study, particularly of this kind of research, no single study proves anything. What you look for is multiple studies of different populations pointing in the same direction. And that's what we began to find. That now we're really understanding this as a scientific fact, because so many studies of so many diverse groups are saying, yep, relationships actually have these physical effects on us. So Social connectedness and health turns out to be a very powerful predictor. Loneliness, which is the opposite of social connection, is as powerful, I'm sure you've heard this, as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day. It's as powerful as untreated high blood pressure in predicting ill health and poor aging. It's as powerful as being obese. The other thing we know is that intimacy keeps us alive. So most of this has been done in studies of traditional marriage, but it doesn't have to be traditional marriage, that married men live on average 7 to 17 years longer than single men, and women live 5 to 12 years longer. Now, women will tell you marriage has always been a worse deal for women than for men, but it's also true that there may be some ceiling effect here, that what we find is that women tend to be more socially connected than men, so that marriage tends to be perhaps less of an improvement for women because they are more naturally connected to others than their male partners. The other thing we've learned from good studies of aging is that if we have broader social networks and if we're more socially active as we age, we have later onset of cognitive decline, and cognitive decline proceeds more slowly if we're more socially active. Now that I've said that, let's go back to the loneliness epidemic, which you all know about. But this is just the most recent statistic from the Gallup organization that I found, which suggests when they did a survey that 17% of adults in the US, 44 million, when they were asked a year ago, are you lonely? They said, not just sometimes, but 17% said, I was lonely a lot of the day yesterday. The loneliest groups in our society tend to be adults under 30, and the World Happiness Report just corroborated this, as well as people in low-income households. We used to think that the loneliest age groups were people who were older, and they have higher rates of loneliness, but not compared with young adults, teenagers and young adults, which is a surprise because I always look at young adults and think, these people they're surrounded by their peers, they're living their best lives. Turns out not to be the case at all. And that, as we know, loneliness is increasing, particularly among young adults. One of the things we do when we do research is we search for mechanisms. It's not sufficient just to say A is associated with B. There are many things that are correlated, but that doesn't mean that one thing causes another. So we have to look at, how could relationships actually change our bodies? By what mechanism? And we've begun to elucidate some very good mechanisms. The best hypothesis we have about how relationships matter is through stress and loneliness. That in fact, we know that people who are more chronically stressed, people who are more lonely, have more rapid health decline because they have more cardiovascular reactivity, their immune systems don't function as well, they have chronic inflammation, which breaks down multiple body systems. So this is a way of telling us as scientists, how could this possibly work? Well, we know it has these very specific mechanisms of breaking us down. You know this from your own experience. Think about when something happens to you during the day and you get upset. You can literally feel your body rev up. Heart rate goes up, you start to breathe faster, right? And that's normal. That's the fight or flight response that we're all supposed to have to meet challenges. But then when the challenge is removed, we're supposed to go back to baseline. Now, if you have somebody you can come home to and complain about this to, or talk to about it, or you have someone you can call, you can literally feel your body calm down. You can feel your body go back to baseline. And that is what we are meant to do. We are meant to re-equilibrate. And what we think happens, first of all, we think that good relationships are emotion regulators. They help us do that with each other. But that the absence of those relationships, or more acrimonious relationships, actually keep us in a mode of chronic fight or flight response that gradually breaks down body systems. Now, one of the things that's great about following people over decades is you get to ask the same questions over time. So we asked many things repeatedly, but we asked the same questions about intimate relationships. We asked the same 6 questions 8 times over 50 years. And so you can create a little graph for each couple, right? How satisfied are you? And what we find, and this is corroborated in other studies, in more diverse samples, that we're happiest when we first get together with our partners. That's not a surprise. That our satisfaction with the relationship goes down when the first child is born, if a couple has kids. And the satisfaction only goes up again when the last child leaves home. And now they've begun to study this, that in fact, relationship satisfaction goes down again if children come back to live at home. Now, and this is just to illustrate the power of being able to ask the same questions over and over again of the same people, because you get to see a path. And of course, not every couple follows this path. This is an average of hundreds of couples, but it shows you the power of looking at people over time. The other thing we find, of course, is that relationships do not have to be smooth. It's easy to get the impression from a talk like mine that we always have to be happy with each other and it has to be warm and loving every day. But no relationship of any consequence is without conflict, is without difficulty. And in fact, we've studied this. We actually brought couples into our laboratory and had them argue with each other. And we asked them to argue about the things they normally argue about. It could be housework or time with friends or sex or raising the kids. And even though people knew they were being videotaped, they quickly forgot about the video cameras and they were just off to the races. And then we had people come in and rate emotion expression as they watched the videotapes of these arguments. And what they found was that it was not the level of anger in the argument that predicted which couples were going to be together 5 years later when we checked in with them. That it was whether our raters could see affection and respect in the couple, even while they were having an argument. And that's important because we often think, it's, arguments are what destroy our relationships. Not true. It's how we work out our differences that has everything to do with how stable relationships are. And that's not just intimate relationships, as we know, and as you've been hearing about. The other thing we get to learn about is what happens to our mood as we get older. And it turns out that we get happier as we get older. As a species, human beings get happier. And other studies have actually found this before we did, but we corroborated this finding, that it turns out as we get older, when you're about in your mid-40s, you start being dimly aware of, this death thing is kind of real. Like, I really am going to die. Life really is short. And even though we all know this long before that, it really begins to hit home. And as that sinks in, rather than making us more depressed, it actually makes us shift in certain ways that make us happier, that make us prioritize emotional well-being. So we end up paying more attention to what's positive. We remember the past more positively. We actually revise our earlier memories in a more positive direction. There's a bumper sticker I like. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. And this is true. So we actually do. We get choosier about how we spend our time. So it turns out that what people do, you watch social networks get trimmed just a little bit so that we stop spending time with those people who actually have been annoying us for years, but we've always felt we really still needed to spend time with. We stop going to those meetings that we just haven't enjoyed for a long time. And finally, we savor the present moment. We literally spend more time stopping and smelling the roses. And all of these shifts make us happier. And we could watch that in the moods of our participants as they got older. So the other thing we do is we get to study how we spend our money. And this actually, the finding I'm going to tell you now comes from another research group. But the question that we wanted to know about was, how do we spend our discretionary income? And are we happier when we spend it on objects, on material things? Or are we happier when we spend it on experiences? So material things could be anything, a new piece of clothing, a piece of jewelry, whatever, electronics, or tickets to a concert, tickets to a museum, a soccer game, a family vacation, okay? And what we know is that the best things in life are not things, that we are happier, and we're happier for longer when we spend money on experiences than when we spend money on material things. So the question is, how does that work? Why should that be? So it turns out that material things just beg for comparison. If I buy a new flat screen TV and I'm all excited about it, then I go to my neighbor's house and she's got a bigger flat screen TV. And I love this quote from Teddy Roosevelt: "Comparison is the thief of joy." That there are good studies that show that the more often in a given day that we compare ourselves to other people, the less happy we are. And material things just beg for comparison, whereas experiences are never quite comparable. So this is a picture of me with that's my niece, and this is Blue Man Group. I don't know if any of you have seen Blue Man Group, but it's a really quite wonderful and mysterious show that's been going in Boston for years. And so we got tickets to take my niece Abby to Blue Man Group. And what we find is that when people pay for experiences, usually they're doing it either with other people or they're making new connections with other people, or both. And that experiences can't be compared. Our visit to Blue Man Group isn't quite like anybody else's. The other thing that we find is that we are bad at predicting what makes us happy. And that's important because what we know, particularly when we talk about social connection, is that we don't think we're going to like connecting with other people that much. Now, maybe you as coaches are a self-selected group and you know this, but most people don't. So let me tell you about an experiment they did in the city of Chicago. Many of you know that Chicago has a commuter rail system and lots of people commute to work on the train. So Nick Epley and a group of researchers at the University of Chicago did a study where they took two comparable groups of people and they said to one group of people, do your commute the way you normally do it. It might be being on your phone, listening to music, reading the newspaper, whatever. And the other group was assigned to talk to a stranger. And they asked people beforehand, how much do you think you're going to like this commute? And the people who were assigned to talking to a stranger thought they were not going to like it nearly as well as the people who were just left alone to themselves. So afterwards, they asked everybody, how much did you enjoy this commute? The people who had talked to a stranger were significantly happier and more energized than the people who had done what they normally do on their commute. Again, just an example of why we are bad at predicting that this kind of social connection actually energizes us and enhances our well-being. Okay, so now I'm going to give you more of the bad news, which is Bowling Alone. That's the title of a book by Robert Putnam, a political scientist here at Harvard, who did a study first in the 1980s of what he calls social capital. How much are we investing in other people? And that means, how much are we going out with people? How much are we joining clubs, civic organizations, houses? How much do we attend houses of worship? Invite people over. And what he found was that starting in the 1950s, there was a dramatic drop in our investment in other people. And the 1950s, what happened in the US in the 1950s? What entered every living room? Television, right. And it's correlational, but everybody was staying home and watching the tube. He went back in the early 2000s and asked the same questions. And what he found when he went back again 25 years later was that everything had gotten much worse. Attending meetings, family dinners, which we know are so important for child development and family cohesion. All of that, having friends over, had dropped dramatically again. And then his question, do you have anybody to confide in? Do you have anybody you can talk to about personal matters? It had been 12% of Americans said they didn't in the 1980s. In the early 2000s, 1 in 4 Americans said there was nobody on the planet they could talk to about personal matters. Now, we know that this did not begin with the digital revolution, but what we think is going on is that the digital revolution is accelerating these processes of increasing isolation. I think about my wife and myself. We come down for breakfast in the morning, and she's on her email, and I'm looking at my phone, scrolling through the news, and we haven't even looked at each other. We haven't even said good morning. How many times have you seen people standing in a beautiful setting and everybody's on their phones, right? Or they're with each other at a dinner table in a restaurant, and we're on our phones. So with all of this, let's talk about well-being at work. Some of you know this, so I apologize if this is telling you what you already know. But the Gallup organization does surveys of well-being at work, and they have done surveys in recent years of 15 million workers all over the globe. And one of their primary questions was, do you have a best friend at work? And what that meant was, is there someone at work who you can talk to about your life, about personal matters? Though the people with a best friend at work, when they studied this, were better at engaging customers if they were customer-facing. They produced higher quality work as rated by supervisors. They were less likely to get injured on the job. They were less likely to leave their jobs for a different opportunity because there were people they wanted to show up for at work. Only 30% of these 15 million workers said they had a best friend at work. Only 3 out of 10. And when they asked the 7 out of 10 who didn't have a friend at work, how engaged are you in your job? Only 1 in 12 said that they felt engaged in their activity. Okay, so really important, if we think about it for the bottom line. The difficulty is that many people in leadership believe that social relationships at work are a distraction, take away from productivity. It turns out to be just the reverse. The other thing is they surveyed CEOs, and half of CEOs said they felt lonely much of the time at work. So with all of this, how do we lean into relationships? How do we do anything to turn this around, these trends I've been telling you about? And for this, I'm going to turn to one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said this. He said, attention is the most basic form of love. If you think about it, our undivided attention is the most valuable thing we have to give each other, and yet it's often the most difficult thing to give each other, as I've been saying. So how do we do that? And you can do it in any moment, right? You can decide how you're going to deploy your attention in a world that's competing for our attention all the time. And there's lots of ways. Certainly structuring our relationships so that we have more time with each other, unstructured time where we just sit and, whether it's having a glass of wine or taking a walk, there are ways to structure our workplaces. We know that a lot of the change has to come from the top, that these are changes in terms of facilitating connections at work that cannot be left to our human resources professionals alone. Family dinners. There are ways to support families in being able to eat together because we know that when families eat together, it's hugely impactful for child development. And finally, community activity. That when we volunteer in our communities, when we join clubs, when we're active, we are much happier as a community and we feel much more like we belong to each other. I want you to do a little exercise with me because here I am talking about, creating better relationships, and it can feel like this enormous task. And you're thinking, look, I've got such a full life. How am I going to fit this in as well? I just wanted to mention that we've created a program. We got a grant from the Arthur Blank Foundation to take some of these findings, some of our findings from our research, and put them into forms that people can use to check in about their lives and their relationships and where they are. And so we created a 5-session program that's a small group facilitated program that we think actually may have a lot of relevance to coaching, that if I were going to start somebody out on a coaching journey, I might start with sessions, small group sessions like these, where they kind of do a life checkup. So the first session is about where am I in my life and how does it shape my perspective on life and on where I'm going. And then the second one is about values and purpose. All of you, this is your bread and butter, helping people clarify this. The third one is about our relationships and who's in my life right now and what would I like to change. Strengthening some relationships, changing others, adding new ones. Life transitions, asking people to think about how they have coped in the past with big life changes and helping them see what strengths they can bring to the new challenges that are always coming our way. And finally, what are some of the techniques that social science has shown us and psychological science for responding to challenge that work well? And what are some of the techniques that don't work very well? So these are just, this is just one technique. There are a variety of programs that are created, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. But there are ways to help people to begin to do this kind of self-reflection and see where they want to go in their lives. And often in this way, we try to help people connect with each other in a group as a way of examining their lives. So my take-home messages are pretty simple. First, it's human connection is a major source of not just happiness, but of physical health and longevity. That social fitness, what I've been talking about is social fitness, taking care of our relationships, actually isn't that hard. We can teach ourselves as adults, we can teach our kids to do this, to get better at it. And that our lives at home and at work actually need to be actively structured, that the path of least resistance is to keep us more and more isolated on screens, more and more separate from each other, and that what we need to do is counter those paths of least resistance by structuring things so that we are more connected and we get more connected to each other, both at home and at work. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for all this time and attention. And
Thank you for listening to this episode of Coaching Revealed, brought to you by the Institute of Coaching. You can learn more about the Institute on our website at instituteofcoaching.org. You can stay up to date with new episodes of our podcast by liking and following Coaching Revealed. You can also find us on social media on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X with the handle Institute of Coaching. We also love hearing from our guests, so please reach out to us with thoughts you have on this episode and any questions you have about coaching. Until next time, this is Emily Tarani with Coaching Revealed.